All right, welcome back to Keepin the Comic, and we're finally diving back into the DC New God series here, specifically with issues number 2 and number 3. Now, this has some phenomenal writing here and a lot of revelations that help give more context to the overall story. Now, here, we'll uncover the origins here of the New Gods and also New Genesis. We'll also be exploring here a new cosmic prophecy that is basically setting the stage here for total destruction across New Genesis, Apokolips, and beyond. Now, as a quick recap here, let's take about 60 seconds or so to talk about what happened here in issue number 1. So we learned that the death of Darkseid basically left a power vacuum, which unleashed some new threats. Now, more importantly, we discovered the existence of a prophesied child, a new god. Metron had let the High Father know that this child could basically either be the herald of salvation or destruction for both worlds. So in fear, the High Father asks Orion to find the child and then to kill him, which is just absolutely brutal. So because Orion didn't want to do it, he went to Earth to find his brother scot-free, aka Mr. Miracle, to get him, find the child, and then hide him. But the thing is, Orion and Scott, they're not the only ones that are looking for the child. Out in India, there was a group of soldiers that were also looking for him as well, and they got pretty close. And when they were about to kill one of the child's parents, the child revealed himself, used his powers, and then took out the soldiers, allowing them to escape and to get free. So when we pick back up here on the story, we start off with this vision that is being shown here, and it starts off by saying that he has always thought of himself as a scavenger. He has had many names since his reaping. Karak Atur at birth, Karak Death Speaker, they named him at the High Gates, Karak Dean to the hordes under his command, Karak Curseborn to those who have fled his gaze to yet tell tales. Nothing more than a scavenger, he thinks to himself. A parasite thrums in his veins. The Nyctophy, hungering, crawling, mad with blood glee, just a carry-on feeder. The scouts have returned. The systems are littered with Sourceborn, they report. Some of them, they say, are even storied to be gods. Gods, he stifles a laugh. The Scourers have brought him an Exterix, a source feeder, mangled and made powerful at the far reaches, chasing after new space, gorging on creation dust. Not quite a sourceborn, certainly no god, but it matters little. And here we see Karak going into battle with the source feeder, as they call him, and then the narration continues on by saying, he has always thought himself a little more than a scavenger. The moment this task was set to him, they were, each and every one of them, gods, devils, heroes, and villains, as good as dead after all. And here we continue to see here some of the destruction that Karak has caused. And the narration continues by saying, New Genesis will crumble. The Devourer at the outer rings shall fall. Apokolips will thunder to rhythms of war. And all of your mistakes shall haunt your dreams, Isaiah, like an eclipse devouring the last light of the gods. Pray, High Father, pray. Though the fall is inevitable, pray. Though the end is coming, pray. And it's here where we begin to see who is having this vision, and we realize here that it's the High Father. And as he awakes, Akala tries to comfort him, and the narration goes on. For even gods may be graced by an unlikely miracle. And what this does here is that it segues us to catch up with scot-free Mr. Miracle, bracing himself to do something that you can clearly see that he doesn't want to do. And here we get to see this letter that he intended to leave his wife Barda, and it says, Dear Barda, I tried to sound brave writing this letter, but the honest truth is that I am so afraid. You know everything about me. My childhood beset by traps and machinations in the fire pits of Apokolips, each trap nested within another. I'd escape from one to fall into the next. Yet through all the pain and fear and terror, I kept going because in my heart, I knew there would be one last lock to break. There will be a final contraption beyond which was freedom and joy and happiness. You were the promise past my final escape. This might come as a surprise, but I doubt myself sometimes. Like I'm waiting for the trap to snap shut. But I reassure myself by looking at the wonder we made, Olivia, as we see their beautiful daughter. Live free, as he says. I'd have to be mad to knowingly walk away from this and into those familiar jaws again. I would be every bit the fool I suspect I am. But Orion was right. I can't turn away from who I am. If I abandon this task, I will not be the man you fell in love with, and I'd want Olivia to only ever look at me with pride. Orion has given me 7 days, and I have already squandered so many, working up the courage to do this. If I asked, I know you'd come with me, but we have a child now, and she is so little. I hold her hand in mine, and I am afraid of ever putting you or her in harm's way. I promise I will return as soon as I can. There's not a trap made that could stop me. Please forgive me. Now, when he gets ready to head to the door, he hears a sound, and when he turns around, he's like, oh shoot. And I'm not sure if it was because he was surprised to see Barda or if it was seeing her getting dressed so fast. Listen, I'm gonna go with both. B-O-A-F, both. And she's pissed because she's like, you're trying to leave without me because of your brother? Because he showed up out of nowhere and talked you into doing something stupid, like thinking you need to leave your wife and child behind? But then Scott is trying to explain. He's like, listen, Orion's been asked to kill a child, and this child might be a god like us. And if I don't find him and save him, but then Barda's like, listen, you can fill me in on the way there, but where are we gonna go to find him? And then Scott's like, listen, I was thinking Oberon. Oberon probably knows what this is all about. Now, real quick, I thought this was kind of cute. Scott's like, you're not mad, right? And she like tosses some clothes or diapers directly in his face, and she's like, listen, you're on diaper duty forever. So now we shift back over here to this location in India, and it's here where we see this gentleman on crutches trying to sneak into what looks like a motel. And when he gets on the inside, he asks his wife this question, and the question he asks is, how is he? And she says, well, his fever's broken, but he still sounds weak and is only speaking in fits and starts. And she sees the medicines that he got, but she's afraid. But then he tries to reassure her. He's like, listen, don't worry, I didn't use our cards. I called Nita from a payphone and she made a money transfer. They won't trace it back to us. We're safe. But still, she's afraid because she's like, you saw what happened. You saw what he did. That's the reason why they want him. He is a godchild after all. Now, they don't know that, but they can clearly see that there's something mystical, something magical, godly about him. And she continues on. She's like, and we don't even know. But then he cuts her off. He's like, we know who he is, Mira. And whatever happened, whatever he did it to save us. And then we get this little like flashback here as he recalls the first time that he met this child. And he mentions how 3 years after they lost Neil, which I assume was their son, almost to the day. And I just find a baby crawling up the stone steps of this temple. I remember thinking, like, such a cliche. You always hear these stories of babies being abandoned at temples, right? I didn't even believe in a god. And he continues on. He's like, I can't explain what happened the other night, Mira. And I don't know who these people are chasing after us, after him. But I know that he's a gift. I don't care how long or how far we have to keep running, but we will keep him safe because he is our son. But here's the thing. On the outside, they're still being tracked because we see someone here talking in his comms. And they mention how they're running voice recognition to track incoming calls. They saw that he had money wired to him here. They saw that he bought medication at a local pharmacy. And being that the place is so crowded, they're basically just buying time until it's less crowded so that they can make their move. And they are sure that whoever they're talking to here on comms, they'll have them soon. Now, the person on comms here is Maxwell Lord. And Maxwell Lord should be dead. And he's the one running this whole operation to get this child. And we see him here talking to a gentleman with a black hat on over in the shadows. And when we see who it is, it's Seraphim. And Maxwell Lord begins to explain to him. He was like, listen, just months ago, I was still in a coma, in a vegetable state. And now here I am making my play to find and control the single most powerful resource on the planet, a god. So he knows who this kid is, even though his men don't know. And we begin to see how Maxwell basically came back to life. He mentioned how it was a miracle that he awoke with this purpose and this drive. And we see this hand outstretched here touching his forehead as Maxwell continues. And he's like, as if acquiring this child was a thing that needed doing. And only by my hand would it be done. So out of curiosity, I had my security team review footage of the moments before I awoke. You see, Seraphim, can you really blame me for feeling a little little ambitious. And then he shows his forehead, and he shows this branding that's on his forehead. And he says, I am renewed after all with divine purpose. And then Seraphim is like, wait, Metron? Now, it's unclear here as to why exactly Metron did this, but we can only assume that Maxwell is basically just being used here as a pawn to find the child. So we pan back over here to Apokolips. And speaking of Metron, we hear the voice of Metron talking to Darkseid. And he mentions how it looks apocalyptic out here right now in Apokolips. And it basically looks like Darkseid here is trying to assume control over Apokolips, but it's not going over well. He mentions how Mantis has basically declared himself overlord and is basically putting his people against him. He also mentions here how Kanto is doing the same thing, how Granny is also doing the same thing down here as well, that basically everyone's trying to rebel and go after him. And what's making him feel even weirder right now is the fact that like Metron has come here and is now calling him friend. And he's like, that doesn't really feel too right for me right now. And then Metron explains, he's like, listen, I'm only here by the source's will. And despite your cold welcome, I am still your friend. Darkseid is dead, but on Earth has lain a child of the source, a new god of unspoken power who awakens now, curiously at your darkest hour. What does that mean to you, Darkseid? And then he has this little puzzled look on his face. He's like, Darkseid is? But before he could even continue, Metron steps in. He's like, High Father of the new Genesis has commanded his dog of war to kill this child. Even as we speak, Orion is on the move. And as Darkseid is trying to like put together this plan of attack to try to regroup everyone, Metron's just like, bro, there's no time. Your foes are of little consequence in the larger scheme, and how Apokolips is doom. I came here not with a prediction, but with a warning. And the end comes with an eclipse, the devouring of the last light of the gods. And it, as he points, is already here. And in this next look here, what we see is Karok, and Karok screams out, Niktari, and he says, send forth the first kind. Let the fall of Apokolips begin, because they're about to storm Apokolips. Now, in this next moment here, what we see is either a flashback or a fast forward of some sort. It's not entirely clear. We see Metron talking to this new character here, the Chronicler. Now, the Chronicler is like a watcher-like cosmic witness who exists to observe and record events. And what the Chronicler does is that he pulls Metron aside to recount the true history of how this all began in the first place, the saga of the gods of the second world. Now, the story here about the old gods has been talking about before, but basically what this does is that this expands upon the details of everything. And he mentions how the second world was at an end. The Urgrun was falling to war eternal, something that's called the Ragnarok, which is basically like a Ragnarok-like event, the fall of the old gods. And here we learn about the three surviving deities that are called, and listen, y'all gonna have to forgive me on these names, but the first name is Arbor Struta. Then we have Parzurum and then Niktar. And Arbor was the benevolent god of nomads and drifters and was possessed of an eternal kindness, the god of fortunate winds and promised lands, clement weathers and fleeting joys. And how she had began to gather herself to the detritus of war, nowhere people, homeless, without a cause, yet tethered to life. They worshipped and followed in her shadow, ever wandering wherever she might go. The youngest of them was Niktar, a god of pathfinders and explorers, god of the unknown and the shrouded, of eternal frontiers. He who was ingenious and undeterred, ambitious and without fear. And how with Arbor, people broached new worlds, sought and marked the unfound lands. Much of what we know of existence is thanks to Niktar. But as Olgrin had said before the madness took him, at the edge of eternal pursuit lies only darkness, and Niktar's ambition would eventually be his undoing. But it's mentioned here that the tale is truly really about the middle brother, Parzurum, god of implements, invention and industry, and how Parzurum, the maker's hand, who knew the inner workings of things, and his worship the tinkerers, the toilers, the smiths, the theorists, the numberers, and ponderers. It was Parzurum who built the island ships of Colin, who made the twin arguments, Moder and Perter. Parzurum who expounded the theories of folding reality. It was his people's hands and minds the first wandering planet was built, Zurum Uan. It was named in his honor before it fell to darker ends and was called Machinatorum. But it was said that some might say that Parzurum foresaw the coming of the end, and he was possessed of such foresight far beyond the ken of even his siblings, and that perhaps he even saw the death of the second world and knew that he would awaken in the third, a god no more, and yet possessed of a telling hand to play in the fourth world. And this is where the siblings' downfall began, because when Niktar and his pathfinders traveled to the edges of all-knowing, where the light of the source was a mere echo, there upon a distant planet they found the remnants of a dwindled civilization that was long gone, but one that had left behind an unusual source of power, the darkness that they talked about. And then this living darkness that was driven by an intelligence unlike anything that they had seen, a primordial argument against all existence, and how in time Niktar and his people were overcome and possessed by the parasitic darkness, warped and turned from the light by its malice employs. And then upon his return to Zurum-On, Niktar made war upon the eldest and killed Arbor Shuda in battle and betrayal. And upon eating his sister's flesh, which just sounds gross, Niktar proclaimed himself the god of explorers no more, but that of a scavenger and of purgers, and his people he called the Niktari. Now that name may sound familiar to you because that is what Karak had called his people when they landed on Apokolips that we saw just now. But then as it pertains here to Parzurum, it was mentioned that they threatened him and then punished him. And what Parzurum told Niktar was that he wasn't going to build any more machines of war or any sort of conquest and pain anymore. And what that did is that they made Niktar imprison him, and then they cased his hands in his own metal, bound him to the hard Zurum-On with his own chains. But the thing is, he had already seen this outcome coming before, because he, more than anyone else, knew the inner workings of things. And even though he was chained, his mind was forever free. So because he foreseen that his capture was going to be imminent and inevitable, Parzurum had already fractured his mind into two arguments, Moder and Perter. The Moder Pixis found itself drawn by the gravitational fallout of the sundering of Urgrund, eventually falling into the orbit of Galactica, which would later come to be known as New Genesis. But the Perter Pixis drifted through an eternity, driven by Parzurum's search for peace and ponderance before finding its way to an infant planet in a far corner of the cosmos. And this is where it would lie undisturbed for a brief age before acknowledging the emergence of intelligent life on the planet and choosing to manifest his presence as one of them. He was Prometheus, who brought fire to the mortals. He was Daius, who taught them to map the sky. He was Ptolemy, who taught them of tools and implements of the making and the inner workings of things. They knew him by many names, and he took on many faces, and yet all of them alike the father of the world. To this day, they remember him. In Gobekli Tepe, they carved his sigil into their pillars. In their stories, he is both revered and feared as the serpent or the owl, bringer of wisdom and knowledge from beyond. In Teotihuacan, they built their halls to look to him on the day of the summer solstice. They showered him with love and adulation and worship. In return, he loved them as his people, as his creation. But he feared for their weakness. He celebrated their victories, learned to relish the minute joys or melancholies turned magnificent by their fleeting lives. But mostly, he worried about them. He was enamored with their brief existences. The entity named Peter had begun to contemplate the one thing he had never experienced. He had begun to wonder what it would be like to die. And each time that he considered this with great excitement, he was also overcome with fear. And in contemplation, he would often walk to the pinnacle of his creation and wonder, what will they do when he is gone? And how he was ready, but he was also wondering, do I just leave them to fend for themselves? What if after all this time, the Niktari come upon this place? Will my children survive? And it's here where we begin to see Peter's contingency plan. and so he broke his vow. Though he had sworn never to make another weapon, just this once he decided to. In ages, a spear all in one, capable of growing, adapting, and evolving to do all that would be asked of it. He shaped it, and so it would move unnoticed among his favorite people. He gave it a mind and a body, unshakable, unbreakable, and to power it, he poured his final breath into its lungs, tethering it forever to the source. And in time, if they ever needed him, he would rise among them, a god, a new god, and he buried the weapon in an ancient vault beneath an old Kola temple before wandering off into the forest, never to return. An old god dwindled at last, just leaves caught on an earthly wind. But then the child was to awaken only when true darkness was upon it. But perhaps it is fitting that he awoke to a kinder hand, more familiar to his maker. The archaeologist found the child while at work, or perhaps while wandering the steppes. Now, this man that we see here finding this baby, this is the man that we see with the woman, the husband and wife that currently have the child right now. So this is how it's coming full circle. And this is where we pick back up on here the chronicler and Metron. And the chronicler says, he's like, and now after an age, the rest of it shall be written, as in the story is not done yet. So then Metron asks the question, he's like, why now? And the chronicler responds back, he's like, this after all, dear Metron, could be the beginning of the end. And it's right here where we see Karok again. And he's being told that, listen, your opposer is beaten. He's chained and conquered for all to see as you wish. The throne of Apokolips is yours, Karok Dean. And then Karok's like, that's not enough. He's like, there were others here leading Apokolips in his stead. I want them found before we leave. But then the question is asked, he's like, leave, my Dean? And he's like, yep, because new Genesis, that is what we will take next. Now, in the meantime here, we do see Mr. Miracle and Barda, and of course, Olivia. They did make it to see Oberon, and they're currently right now on his island south of Las Vegas. And it turns out Oberon has just the tool that they need to be able to find and locate this child. Oberon had created this thing called the Escapatron, which is kind of a tracking portal device, which was basically perfectly suited to find people who are on the run. It has the ability here to find a source signature and basically would be able to teleport them right there. Right where? Right to where the child would be that they're looking for. And Oberon offers to go with them because he's like, listen, you got the baby, just in case things get a little bit hairy, I should probably come along with you. So when we jump back to see where they are, we first hear the voice here of Metron, and he's talking to the chronicler. And he's like, tell me, have you ever come across the earthly mortals and their attempts at explaining existence with numbers? And he mentions how even though they have a limited grasp on things, on occasion they do come up with some very interesting things. And he mentions how he told him on once about the butterfly effect and how it fascinated him to no end. Now, what we're also seeing here as well is Mr. Lord's people, Maxwell Lord's people here, chasing down this couple with a child, a godchild here in a taxi, and they're getting very close. And Metron continues to say how a butterfly flapping its wings could cause a storm days later. And right when he says that, that's when we see Mr. Miracle jump down on top of that taxi. And the voice of Metron says, these past days, I have been setting aloft many butterflies. So now we know what Metron's tampering is doing. And he says, perhaps you are right to record your chronicle in the expectation of the end. But me, I will look for a miracle in the flapping of gentle wings, as we see Mr. Miracle show up to save the day. And he says to Maxwell Lord's men, he's like, you boys are gonna be in so much trouble. And right when he says that, Maxwell Lord's people, well, let's say that their vehicle gets hit with an unstoppable force. And that unstoppable force was Barda. And oh my goodness, this is set up for so many good stories that can be told here. I got a lot of questions, but I'm gonna leave it because I wanna hear what your guys' questions are too. What do you think is gonna happen next next here, leave it down below in the comments. If you want to get more context here to what happened in the very first issue, then check out that link that's going to be down below in the description here. Leave a like on this video for the YouTube algorithm. Also subscribe if you're new to the channel. Join our Patreon here, which is a way that you can support the channel. You can also unlock exclusive benefits like being able to have a special section in our Discord, opportunities to select what videos we cover next, and much more. Appreciate you watching, and as always, thank you so much for kicking it with Keepin' It Comic. Bye!